NASA was mapping Greenland's ice when their radar hit something that should not exist. A perfect geometric grid. Straight lines, right angles, rectangular shapes buried 100 feet deep. Nature does not make grids. Someone built a city under the ice and left it there. A city with a nuclear reactor, a barbershop, and 600 missiles that were supposed to end the world. They abandoned it in 1967. They left behind 200,000 litres of diesel, toxic chemicals that never break down, and 47,000 gallons of radioactive water. They poured it into a hole in the ice and walked away. They assumed the cold would keep their secrets forever. The ice is melting, and it gets worse. In September of 2023, something shook the entire planet for 9 straight days. Every seismometer on Earth picked up the same signal, a clean rhythmic pulse, once every 92 seconds. Scientists called it an unidentified seismic object. When they traced it to its source, what they found was a mega tsunami 200 meters tall, trapped inside a fjord, sloshing back and forth like water in a bathtub. For 9 days. A cruise ship with 206 people on board had been stuck in those same waters just 48 hours earlier. This is the story they do not want you to forget. But before we begin, if you enjoy these nighttime journeys, remember to like and subscribe. It helps us bringing you more videos like this. Now, let's begin. Somewhere beneath the ice of Greenland there is a city that no one can see. It has streets, it has buildings, it has a chapel and a barbershop and a nuclear reactor that once hummed with power. It has been buried for more than half a century, sinking deeper every year under the weight of fresh snowfall, and it is not empty. It holds 200,000 litres of diesel fuel. It holds toxic chemicals that never break down. It holds radioactive cooling water poured into a hole in the ice and left to freeze. The people who abandoned it believed the cold would keep their secrets forever. They were wrong. The ice is melting, and when it finally gives up what it has been holding, the consequences will reach far beyond Greenland. But that is only one part of this story, because in September of 2023, something shook the entire planet for 9 straight days. A signal so strange that scientists around the world had no explanation. They called it an unidentified seismic object, and when they finally traced it to its source, what they found was terrifying. A mountain had collapsed into a fjord in East Greenland, triggering a mega tsunami 200 meters tall. A wave half the height of the Empire State Building, sloshing back and forth inside a narrow canyon like water in a bathtub. For 9 days, and a cruise ship carrying 206 passengers had been stuck in those same waters just 48 hours before it happened. Tonight, we're going to tell you the full story. The secret military base, the nuclear missiles that were supposed to hide beneath the ice, the scientists who accidentally discovered 100,000 years of climate history while digging tunnels for war, and the moment the Earth itself began to vibrate with a sound no one had ever heard before. This is the story of Greenland, the island that holds our past, our secrets, and perhaps our future. And it begins with a plane flying 30,000 feet above the ice. In April of 2024, a Gulfstream 3 research aircraft was cruising over the northwest coast of Greenland. On board were 2 NASA scientists named Alex Gardner and Chad Green. They worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California, and their mission that day was straightforward. They were testing a new radar system called UAVSAR. The instrument was mounted to the belly of the aircraft, and as the plane flew, it fired radar waves downward through the ice sheet. The waves would punch through the frozen layers, hit the bedrock below and bounce back. The returning signals painted a picture of what lay beneath the surface. For hours, the monitors showed exactly what you would expect. Jagged lines, irregular shapes, the natural contours of rock and sediment buried under a mile of ancient ice. Greenland from the air looks like nothing at all, a flat white expanse stretching to every horizon. No trees, no buildings, no landmarks, just ice and sky and the faint curve of the earth. Chad Green stared out the window and snapped a photograph. There was nothing to photograph. That was the point. The emptiness was absolute. And then the radar returned something that was not empty at all, right in the middle of the natural lines. A pattern appeared on the monitor. Straight edges, right angles, a grid of rectangular shapes arranged in parallel rows. Alex Gardner leaned forward and studied the image. Nature does not make perfect grids 100 feet underground. Rocks do not arrange themselves into corridors. Ice does not form right angles. He looked at Chad. Neither of them spoke for a moment. They circled back and ran the scan again. The image sharpened. The grid was undeniable. They were looking at structures, walls, tunnels, the skeleton of something built by human hands and then swallowed whole by the glacier. According to the NASA Earth Observatory report published later that year, Gardner said he did not know what it was at first. But as they compared the radar map to old military blueprints, the truth became clear. The parallel structures on the screen matched the planned layout of a place called Camp Sentry, a United States Army base built inside the Greenland ice sheet in 1959, a base that had been abandoned, buried, and officially forgotten for nearly 60 years, and a base that was hiding something the American public was never supposed to know about. To understand what Alex Gardner found beneath the ice, we need to go back to the late 1950s. The Cold War was at its most dangerous. The United States and the Soviet Union stood on opposite sides of an ideological and nuclear divide. Both nations had hydrogen bombs powerful enough to erase cities. Both were building missiles to carry those bombs across continents. And both were looking for ways to strike first if the unthinkable happened. Geography mattered. The shortest route between the Soviet Union and the American mainland ran directly over the Arctic. Greenland, a vast island covered almost entirely by ice, sat right in the middle of that route. It was a Danish territory, remote and sparsely populated but strategically priceless. The United States already had a presence there. In 1951, America and Denmark signed the Defense of Greenland Agreement, allowing the US military to build bases on the island. The most important of these was Thule Air Base, located on the northwest coast, less than 1,000 miles from the North Pole. Thule served as a refueling point for long-range bombers and as part of the ballistic missile early warning system, a chain of radar stations designed to detect Soviet missiles as they arced over the pole. But the Pentagon wanted more than radar stations. Planners in Washington were looking for a way to put nuclear missiles close enough to the Soviet Union that they could strike within minutes, while keeping those missiles hidden and mobile so the Soviets could never target them. The ice sheet of Greenland offered a tantalizing possibility. What if you could build a network of tunnels beneath the ice? What if you could lay railroad tracks inside those tunnels and mount nuclear warheads on rail cars that moved, constantly shifting position so the enemy could never pin them down? The idea was audacious. It was also, as it turned out, insane. The project was given a code name, Project Iceworm, and it would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War for nearly 4 decades. But before you could build a missile network inside a glacier, you had to prove it was possible to live and work inside a glacier at all. You needed a test site, a proof of concept, a place where engineers could dig tunnels, install power systems, and see whether human beings could survive for months beneath the ice. You needed Camp Sentry. Construction began in June of 1959 under the command of Colonel John Kirkering. The site was located about 240 kilometers east of Thule Air Base, deep in the interior of the ice sheet. Getting there was an ordeal in itself. There were no roads. The terrain was featureless frozen white in every direction. Temperatures averaged -23 degrees Celsius. Wind could scour exposed skin raw in minutes. Hundreds of military engineers and technicians made the journey from Thule, dragging 6,000 tons of supplies across the ice on massive sleds called heavy swings. The sleds moved at a maximum speed of 2 miles per hour. The trip took roughly 70 hours. When they arrived, the engineers unpacked a fleet of Swiss-made machines called Peter plows. These were enormous rotating cutters designed to chew through compacted snow and ice. The Peter plows carved deep trenches into the surface, open to the sky, long and straight and wide enough to work inside. The trenches were not the final product, they were the mould. Once a trench was cut, workers lowered prefabricated corrugated steel arches into the channel, forming a curved roof. Then they shoveled snow back over the arches and let it harden. Within days, the snow compressed and bonded, sealing the arches beneath a rigid canopy of ice. What had been an open trench was now an underground tunnel, and inside these tunnels the army built a town, 26 tunnels in all, stretching nearly 2 miles in total length. The longest, called Main Street, ran more than 1,000 feet. Off Main Street branched corridors leading to dormitories, a mess hall and kitchen, a hospital, a communications centre, a recreation hall with a movie theatre, a chapel, a laundry, and yes, a barbershop. Prefabricated wooden buildings were erected inside the tunnels, with airspace left on every side to slow the transfer of heat to the ice walls. The engineers drilled a well deep into the glacier that produced 10,000 gallons of fresh water every day. Insulated piping carried water and electricity through the corridors. Escape hatches were built in case of emergency. The base could house up to 200 men. It had hot showers, hot food, and a library. From the inside, if you ignored the fact that the walls were made of compacted snow and the ceiling curved like the inside of a frozen barrel, you could almost forget where you were. Almost. But the moment you stepped out of your quarters and into Main Street, the reality reasserted itself. The air was cold and still, the walls glittered faintly, and beneath every sound, the rumble of machinery, the hiss of ventilation, the murmur of conversation, there was a deeper silence. The silence of ice stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction, pressing down with the weight of centuries. Camp Sentry was finished by October of 1960. The army had built an underground city in less than 2 years. The press was invited. Journalists from the New York Times and National Geographic toured the tunnels and wrote admiring stories about American ingenuity conquering the Arctic frontier. The army produced a short documentary film showing smiling soldiers eating in the mess hall, getting haircuts, and working in laboratories. The narration was cheerful and confident. Camp Sentry was presented as a remote research community, a place where brave men pushed the boundaries of human knowledge in one of the harshest environments on Earth. What the journalists were not told, what most of the soldiers living at Camp Sentry were not told, was the truth. The science was real. The research did happen. But it was a cover story. Camp Sentry was not built to study ice. It was built to test whether the United States military could hide nuclear weapons inside a glacier, and the most extraordinary part of the entire operation was still being assembled in the deepest tunnel of the base, a nuclear reactor, the first of its kind ever installed inside a sheet of ice. Its designation was PM2A, portable, medium power, second generation, Model A, and it was about to change everything, for better and for worse. The reactor arrived in pieces. It had been designed by the American Locomotive Company and built in just 18 months, a pace that would be, unthinkable by modern standards. The components were shipped to Thule Air Base by sea, then loaded onto over snow trailers and dragged 138 miles across the ice sheet to Camp Sentry. Each piece of the reactor was handled with extreme care. In the sub-freezing temperatures of Greenland, metal becomes brittle. A careless bump, a dropped component, and the steel could crack like glass. Major Jim Barnett, the officer in charge of the reactor installation, later said they took every precaution in the book, and some that were not in the book, to make sure it would work the first time. The PM2A was a pressurized water reactor. It used uranium-235 enriched to 93%, weapons-grade material, to generate heat. That heat turned water into steam. The steam drove a turbine. The turbine produced electricity. The entire system was designed to be compact enough to fit inside a tunnel carved from ice, yet powerful enough to supply all the electricity and heating that Camp Sentry needed. The army boasted that 44 pounds of uranium could replace more than 1 million gallons of diesel fuel. In a location where every gallon of diesel had to be dragged across 100 miles of frozen wasteland, that was not a trivial advantage. On October 3rd, 1960, the reactor went critical for the first time. That is the technical term for the moment a nuclear reactor begins sustaining a chain reaction, the moment it starts producing power. The engineers watched the needles on their instruments climb. The reactor was working. For a brief moment there was celebration. They had done it. They had brought nuclear power to the Arctic. And then the alarms went off. The reactor was leaking neutrons. These subatomic particles were escaping through gaps in the shielding and flooding the tunnel where the operators stood. Neutron radiation is invisible. You cannot see it, smell it, or feel it in the moment. But it tears, through biological tissue, damaging cells, and DNA. Prolonged exposure can cause radiation sickness, cancer, and death. The engineers scrambled. They shut the reactor down immediately, slamming the control rods back into the core to halt the chain reaction. Then they improvised. They grabbed lead bricks, heavy and dense, and stacked them against the points where neutrons were escaping. They filled 55-gallon drums with ice and sawdust and lined them up as makeshift shielding. It was crude, it was desperate, and it worked, at least enough to allow the reactor to be restarted. The PM2A ran for 33 months. During that time, it produced over 11 million kilowatt-hours of electricity. It powered the lights, the heating system, the water pumps, the communications equipment, and every other piece of machinery that kept Camp Century alive. It set a record of more than 2,500 consecutive hours of uninterrupted power production during the winter of 1962 to 1963. By any engineering measure, it was a remarkable achievement. But the radiation problem never fully went away. The reactor continued to leak neutrons throughout its operational life. The men who worked closest to it received doses that, by modern standards, would be considered unsafe. The Army fashioned additional shields and imposed strict protocols for time spent near the reactor housing. But in the confined tunnels of Camp Century, there was only so much distance you could put between yourself and a nuclear machine. Life inside Camp Century was unlike anything these soldiers had experienced. A young engineer named Austin Kovacs arrived at the base and found a world that was simultaneously mundane and surreal. You could wake up in a warm bunk, walk down a corridor and eat a hot breakfast in the mess hall. You could get a haircut, watch a movie, write a letter home. The routine felt normal, but nothing about the setting was normal. The yard walls were ice. Not smooth polished ice like a skating rink, but rough compacted snow that glittered under the fluorescent lights. The ceiling arched overhead, a steel shell coated in frost. Main Street stretched away in both directions, a long pale corridor that hummed with the sound of generators and the ever-present rumble of the nuclear reactor somewhere in the depths of the base. The temperature in the tunnels hovered around freezing. Men wore layers and moved quickly between heated buildings. Officers could be stationed at Camp Century for up to 6 months at a time. Enlisted men served 4-month rotations. The isolation was severe. The nearest settlement, a tiny Greenlandic village called Itokortormit, was hundreds of miles away. There was no town to visit, no bar to drink in, no landscape to walk through. Outside the base, the ice sheet was a white void stretching to the horizon in every direction. A popular joke among the troops was that there was a pretty girl hiding behind every tree. There were no trees. The psychological toll was real. Dr. Robert Weiss, a young physician forced to cut short his medical residency to serve as the camp doctor, later described the disorientation of living underground for months. Day and night lost meaning. The sun either never set or never rose depending on the season. Men developed routines to cope. Movie nights were important. Cocktails were permitted. The chapel held services. Small rituals of normalcy helped keep minds intact in a place that was anything but normal. According to the 2021 book Camp Century, the untold story of America's secret Arctic military base under the Greenland ice, only one woman ever set foot in the camp, a Danish doctor. In every other respect, it was an all-male world sealed beneath the ice, performing work that most of the inhabitants did not fully understand. Because while the soldiers lived their peculiar underground lives, getting haircuts and watching films, and complaining about the food, a secret operation was underway that none of them were cleared to know about. Deep beneath the base, a team was drilling. Not for water, not for science, at least not officially. They were drilling straight down through the ice sheet, extracting a cylinder of frozen material that would become one of the most important scientific artifacts of the 20th century. But that drill had a dual purpose. The army wanted to know exactly how the ice behaved at depth, how it flowed, how it deformed under pressure. Because if Project Iceworm was going to work, if you were going to thread 4,000 kilometers of railroad tunnel through this glacier, you needed to understand the ice the way a sailor understands the sea. The men at Camp Century did not know about Project Iceworm. They did not know that their cozy underground town with its barbershop and chapel was a prototype for a vast nuclear weapons network. They did not know that the original plan called for hundreds of launch sites connected by rail, carrying 600 nuclear missiles that could be shuffled constantly beneath the ice, invisible to Soviet satellites, ready to pop up and fire at a moment's notice. They did not know that the tunnels they walked through every day were a test, and that the test was being watched very carefully by planners in Washington who wanted to know one thing. Could you build a city under the ice and keep it running long enough to fight a nuclear war from it? The answer, as it turned out, was no. A glacier looks solid. It looks permanent. Stand on the surface and you see nothing but flat white stillness, a landscape so unchanging it feels eternal. But a glacier is not solid in the way that rock is solid. Ice is a viscoelastic material. It flows, slowly, imperceptibly, but relentlessly. Under the immense pressure of its own weight, ice deforms, it creeps, it squeezes, and anything embedded inside it gets squeezed too. By 1962, barely 2 years after Camp Century was completed, the men began to notice that the tunnels were shrinking. The walls were moving inward, the ceilings were dropping, the arched steel supports that had seemed so sturdy when they were installed were bending under the slow but unstoppable pressure of the ice. Doors that had swung freely now stuck in their frames. Corridors that a man could walk through comfortably now required him to duck. Austin Kovacs described how the army formed what they called ice trimming squads. These were teams of men armed with chainsaws and heavy picks who went into the tunnels and spent their days cutting the walls back. They would shave inches of ice from the ceiling, carve the walls back to their original dimensions and clear the debris. It was exhausting and dangerous work, and it was futile. The ice returned. Within weeks, sometimes within days, the walls had crept back to where they had been. The glacier was not going to stop. It had been flowing for tens of thousands of years. A few steel arches and some wooden buildings were not going to change that. The reactor room was hit especially hard. According to a 1961 report by the Army Corps of Engineers, the ceiling of the reactor chamber sagged by 5 feet in just a couple of years. The implications were terrifying. If the ceiling continued to drop, it would crush the nuclear reactor, and a crushed nuclear reactor inside a glacier, surrounded by radioactive waste and diesel fuel, deep in the ice sheet of an allied nation, would not be a leak. It would be a catastrophe. In 1962, the Army made a decision. Camp Century would no longer operate year-round. It would be staffed only during the summer months, when conditions were marginally more manageable. The reactor was shut down in July of 1963 for planned maintenance. It never restarted. The Army quietly announced that the PM2A would not resume operation. The dismantling of the reactor was its own ordeal. Commanding Officer Joseph Franklin supervised the removal of the reactor core, the most radioactive component. Workers in protective gear extracted the fuel elements and packed them into 7 lead-lined shipping casks. Each cask weighed nearly 9 metric tons. The work was done in temperatures that plunged to negative 29 degrees Celsius, with winds gusting to 15 meters per second. Franklin himself spent about 2 minutes in a radiation field he estimated at 2,000 rads per hour, enough to make a person seriously ill. After Greenland, the Army sent him to Bethesda Naval Hospital for examination. The core was loaded onto snow trailers, dragged back to Thule Air Base, and eventually shipped to the National Reactor Testing Station in Idaho, where it was buried in a nuclear waste dump. The secondary systems, the non-radioactive components, were disassembled and shipped to an Army depot in Pennsylvania. The vapor containment sections went by barge to the Savannah River nuclear facility. The reactor was gone. But the Army left a parting gift. During its 33 months of operation, the PM2A had produced approximately 47,000 gallons of liquid radioactive waste. Cooling water that had circulated through the reactor, picking up radioactive contamination as it went. This water was not packed into casks and shipped home. It was poured into a sump, a hole in the ice, and left to freeze. The assumption was simple. The ice would bury it. The cold would contain it. No one would ever have to deal with it again. They were wrong about that too. But in 1963, nobody was thinking about melting ice. The term global warming had not even been coined. The Arctic was eternal. The ice was forever. That is what everyone believed. And with the reactor removed and the tunnel slowly collapsing, the Army turned its attention to the next phase of the plan. The missiles, the railroad, the 4,000 kilometers of tunnel that would make Greenland into the most powerful nuclear launch pad on Earth. Project Iceworm was about to get its final verdict, and the ice was about to deliver it. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications. Project Iceworm envisioned a network of tunnels stretching 4,000 kilometers beneath the Greenland ice sheet. That is roughly the distance from New York to Los Angeles. Inside these tunnels, the Army would lay railroad tracks, and on those tracks would ride mobile launch platforms carrying 600 nuclear missiles, each one armed with a warhead capable of reaching the Soviet Union within minutes. The missiles would never stay in one place. They would shuttle constantly through the tunnel network, moving from siding to siding, their positions changing hour by hour. Soviet satellites, even if they could somehow peer through a mile of ice, would never know where the missiles were at any given moment. You cannot destroy what you cannot find, and you cannot find something that is always moving inside a frozen labyrinth the size of a small country. The beauty of the concept, from a military standpoint, was its survivability. A conventional missile base, a hardened silo bolted to the ground in Montana or North Dakota, was a fixed target. The Soviets could identify it, track it, and aim their own missiles at it. In a nuclear exchange, those silos would be among the first things to be destroyed. But a missile network under the Greenland ice sheet would be essentially invulnerable. Even if the Soviets dropped nuclear weapons on the ice above, the tunnels below would be insulated by hundreds of feet of frozen material. The missiles would survive, and they could be launched through vertical shafts that could be drilled to the surface in a matter of hours. Power for this vast underground railroad would come from dozens of portable nuclear reactors, copies of the PM-2A, heating, lighting, ventilation, communications, all running on atomic energy. The personnel needed to operate and maintain the network would number in the thousands, living in underground barracks connected to the tunnel system. Supply depots, repair shops, command centers, all would be carved from the ice. Camp Sentry was the prototype. If it worked, the full network would follow. There was one problem that the planners in Washington seemed to have underestimated. They needed permission. Greenland was not American soil. It was a territory of Denmark, and the United States was building on it under the terms of the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement. That agreement allowed for military bases. It said nothing about nuclear missiles. Denmark had a strict policy against nuclear weapons on its soil. The Danish public and parliament were firmly opposed. Introducing 600 nuclear warheads onto Danish territory, even frozen territory 8,000 miles from Copenhagen, would have been a political earthquake. The planners knew this. They also knew that asking for permission and being told no would kill the project before it started. So they found a workaround. In 1958, US Ambassador Val Petersen approached Danish Prime Minister H.C. Hansen about the possibility of nuclear activities in Greenland. The conversation was carefully framed. Petersen did not present a concrete plan. He did not use the words nuclear missiles or launch sites. He raised the subject obliquely, diplomatically, in the way that governments discuss things they want to do but do not want to be seen discussing. Hansen's response was a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. He replied that the ambassador had not submitted any concrete plan regarding such matters, nor had he asked a question about the attitude of the Danish government. Hansen said he did not think the remarks gave rise to any comments from his side. It was a non-answer, a door left carefully ajar. The US Army chose to interpret it as a green light. Project Iceworm proceeded without formal Danish approval and without the Danish government being told what was actually happening at Camp Sentry. This would come back to haunt everyone involved. But not for decades. Meanwhile, Camp Sentry was delivering its verdict on the feasibility of the plan, and the verdict was devastating. The ice would not cooperate. The tunnels deformed faster than they could be maintained. The ceilings sagged. The walls squeezed inward. The steel arches buckled. Every month required more cutting, more shoring, more improvisation to keep the corridors passable. The ice trimming squads worked constantly and fell further behind. A tunnel system that could not maintain its shape for 2 years could not sustain a missile network for 20. The nuclear reactor leaked radiation from the day it was turned on. The engineering challenges of keeping a nuclear power plant running inside a dynamic, moving body of ice were more severe than anyone had anticipated. The reactor had been designed for a power output of over 1,500 kilowatts, but Camp Sentry only needed between 300 and 500 kilowatts. The mismatch created inefficiencies and complications. Prolonged shutdowns caused by problems with the conventional turbine generator further undermined reliability. And there was the cold. Not ordinary cold, but a cold so extreme that metal behaved differently, seals failed unexpectedly, and human beings could not work outdoors for more than short bursts without risking frostbite or worse. Every piece of equipment, every vehicle, every tool had to be designed or modified for conditions that most engineers had never encountered. The Army held on as long as it could, but by 1963 the Joint Chiefs of Staff made their decision. Project Iceworm was cancelled. The missile tunnels would not be built. The 600 warheads would never ride their underground railroad. The dream of an invulnerable nuclear launch pad beneath the Greenland ice sheet was dead. Camp Sentry continued to operate in a reduced capacity for a few more years, staffed only during the summer months. Scientists conducted legitimate research. Ice was studied, weather data was collected, and deep beneath the base a drilling team continued boring into the ice sheet, extracting the core that would become one of the most important scientific discoveries of the century. But we will come back to that. In 1967, the last soldier walked out of Camp Sentry, the lights were turned off, the hatch was sealed, and the ice began its slow, patient work of reclaiming what the Army had built. The tunnels compressed, the steel arches bent, the wooden buildings crumpled. Snow fell and covered the entrance hatches. Year after year, the base sank deeper. Within a decade, there was nothing visible on the surface, just flat white ice and blue sky stretching to every horizon. If you walked over the spot where Camp Sentry lay buried, you would never know it was there. But buried did not mean gone. The buildings were still there, crushed but intact enough to show up on radar decades later. The diesel fuel tanks were still there, their contents slowly leaking into the surrounding ice. The sewage pits were still there, 240,000 litres of human waste frozen in place. The PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, toxic industrial chemicals used in electrical equipment and building materials were still there. And the radioactive cooling water, all 47,000 gallons of it, was still there in its frozen sump, a pool of contaminated ice sitting in the dark. The Army left all of it behind, not out of carelessness, but out of a calculation that seemed perfectly rational at the time. The Greenland ice sheet was gaining mass. Every year more snow fell than melted. The waste would be buried deeper and deeper, entombed under an ever-growing layer of ice. In 1,000 years, it would be hundreds of meters down. In 10,000 years, it would be unreachable. The ice was the ultimate containment vessel, permanent, cold, and indifferent. For 3 decades, no one questioned this logic. Camp Sentry faded from public awareness. The soldiers who had served there moved on with their lives. The Army filed its reports and moved on to other projects. Denmark had no reason to think about an abandoned research station in a part of Greenland where nobody lived and nobody went. Then, in 1995, the truth began to surface. A political scandal in Denmark triggered an investigation into nuclear weapons activities on Danish territory during the Cold War. The Danish Parliament commissioned the Danish Institute of International Affairs to examine what the United States military had been doing in Greenland. Investigators began combing through declassified American documents, piecing together the story of Thule Air Base, the defense, agreement, and the various installations that had been built on Greenland soil. And then they found a document from 1960 titled Strategic Value of the Greenland Ice Cap. When they opened it, one word jumped off the page: Iceworm. The report laid out the entire plan: the 4,000 kilometers of tunnels, the 600 nuclear missiles, the portable reactors, the mobile launch platforms riding their underground railroad beneath the ice. The fact that none of this had been disclosed to the Danish government. The fact that the United States had been planning to turn Danish territory into the largest covert nuclear weapons installation in the world, completely behind Denmark's back. When the findings were made public in 1997, the diplomatic fallout was immediate. The Danish public was furious. Their government's policy of opposing nuclear weapons on Danish soil had been flagrantly violated. The Americans had not only brought a nuclear reactor to Greenland, they had planned to bring 600 nuclear warheads, and they had done it in secret, relying on a deliberately ambiguous conversation between an ambassador and a prime minister, as their only authorization. The political storm eventually subsided. Project Iceworm had been cancelled decades earlier. The missiles had never been deployed. The reactor had been removed. Relations between the United States and Denmark were too important to be permanently damaged by a Cold War secret, however explosive. But the damage at Camp Century was not political. It was physical. And it was still there, sinking deeper into the ice, waiting. For another 20 years, that is where the story sat. An embarrassing chapter of Cold War history closed and buried, literally and figuratively. Scientists knew about Camp Century. Historians wrote about it. But no one was particularly worried about the waste. The ice sheet was vast and cold, and as far as anyone could tell, permanent. Then the climate began to change, and a glaciologist named William Colgan asked a question that no one had thought to ask before. What if the ice melts? Before we get to the melting, we need to talk about what may be the most extraordinary thing that ever came out of Camp Century. Not a weapon, not a reactor, not a military secret. A cylinder of ice. While the soldiers of Camp Century were living their surreal underground lives, while the nuclear reactor hummed and leaked, and the ice trimming squads fought their losing battle against the walls, a small team of scientists was conducting what appeared to be a routine research project. They were drilling straight down through the ice sheet. The project was led by Chester Langway and B. Lyle Hansen, two pioneering glaciologists who understood that the ice beneath their feet contained something far more valuable than anything Project Iceworm could have put inside it. History. The ice sheet of Greenland has been building for hundreds of thousands of years. Each winter, snow falls and accumulates. Each layer compresses under the weight of the layers above it, turning from loose powder to dense firn and eventually to solid glacier ice. And as each layer forms, it captures a snapshot of the atmosphere at that moment. Air bubbles trapped in the ice preserve the chemical composition of ancient air. Volcanic eruptions leave thin bands of ash. Changes in temperature alter the ratio of oxygen isotopes in the snow, creating a thermometer that can be read thousands of years after the fact. Drilling through the ice and extracting a core, a continuous cylinder of frozen material, is like reading a book written in layers. The deeper you go, the further back in time you travel. And in the early 1960s, nobody had ever read this particular book. No one had ever drilled all the way through a major ice sheet to the bedrock below. Langway and Hansen intended to be the first. The drilling began in 1963 using a specially designed thermal drill that melted its way through the ice. Progress was slow. The ice sheet at Camp Century was roughly 1,400 meters thick, nearly a mile. The drill had to be lowered, operated, raised, and its core extracted in sections. Each section was carefully labelled and stored in a freezer. Year after year, the drill crept deeper. In the summer of 1966, after 5 years of steady labour, the drill punched through the bottom of the ice sheet and into the bedrock of Greenland itself. They had done it. The first ice core to penetrate an entire ice sheet. 1,400 metres of continuous frozen record stretching back 100,000 years, and then, almost on impulse, they kept going. The drill bit into the rock and sediment beneath the ice, extracting about 3.5 metres of frozen subglacial material. Mud, gravel, and fragments of what had once been the surface of Greenland, buried under a mile of ice for an unimaginably long time. They only stopped when a drill bearing burned out. Nobody thought much of the subglacial material at the time. The ice core was the prize. When the oxygen isotope analysis was published in 1969 in the journal Science, the paper carried a title that captured the magnitude of the discovery. 1,000 centuries of climatic record from Camp Century on the Greenland ice sheet. Before this core, scientists had no reliable way to look far back into Earth's climate history. Weather records went back perhaps a century. Tree rings went back a few thousand years. Ocean sediment cores provided clues but lacked resolution. The Camp Century ice core changed everything. It revealed that Earth's climate had swung dramatically over the past 100,000 years, oscillating between warm periods and ice ages with a regularity and amplitude that stunned researchers. Glaciologist William Colgan would later say that before the Camp Century core, we did not really have a reliable way of looking into the Earth's past climate. When the US pulled out the Camp Century core, it provided a window into the past like people had never known before. The subglacial sediment, those 3.5 meters of frozen dirt, was stored in jars and shipped to an Army laboratory freezer in Buffalo, New York. At some point, it was transferred to the Center for Ice and Climate at the Niels Bohr Institute at the University of Copenhagen, and there, in a freezer full of thousands of ice core boxes, it was forgotten. For 50 years it sat in the cold, unlabeled, unexamined, gathering frost. The scientists who had collected it retired or died. The records of its transfer grew faded. Nobody remembered it was there. Until 2017, when a routine inventory of the Copenhagen freezer turned up a set of old glass jars with fading labels. The labels read, Camp Century Sub-Ice. The discovery sent a jolt through the glaciology community. Researchers from the United States and Europe were invited to analyze the samples using modern techniques that had not existed in 1966. What they found was astonishing. Under a microscope, a scientist named Andrew Christ noticed peculiar black specks floating in the wash water as they cleaned the sediment. He collected them and looked closer. They were plant fossils, twigs, leaves, and moss. Frozen, dried, but unmistakable. They were looking at the remains of a tundra ecosystem, plants that had grown on the surface of Greenland when the land was ice-free. The findings were published in 2021 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The implications were profound. The fossils proved that the Greenland ice sheet had melted substantially at least once within the past million years. Not during some incomprehensibly distant era, but within a geological time frame that was, in climate terms, recent. And it had melted during a period when global temperatures were only moderately warmer than pre-industrial levels, less than 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer. This meant the Greenland ice sheet was more vulnerable than scientists had assumed. If it had melted before under relatively modest warming, it could melt again. And if it melted entirely, global sea levels would rise by about 7.5 meters, roughly 24 feet. Enough to reshape coastlines around the world, enough to submerge the land on which Boston, London, and Shanghai now stand. The Camp Century ice core, pulled from a hole drilled for a secret nuclear weapons program, had delivered a warning about the future of the planet. The irony was almost too neat. A Cold War military project had accidentally produced one of the most important pieces of evidence for climate change ever found. And that brings us back to the waste. In 2016, William Colgan, a climate and glacier scientist at York University in Toronto, published a study that asked the question everyone had been avoiding. He and his team took an inventory of the waste buried at Camp Century, using historical Army Corps of Engineers documents to estimate what was there and where it was located. They ran climate model simulations to determine whether the ice would continue to bury the waste or whether warming might reverse the process. The results were alarming. Colgan estimated that the Camp Century site contained approximately 9,000 tons of physical waste spread over an area the size of 100 football fields. This included the crushed buildings, the steel arches, the railroad equipment, and the infrastructure of the base itself. It included roughly 200,000 litres of diesel fuel, enough for a car to drive around the Earth 80 times. It included an estimated 240,000 litres of wastewater, sewage frozen in place since the 1960s. It almost certainly included polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, toxic chemicals that were widely used in electrical equipment and construction materials of that era. PCBs do not break down. They persist in the environment indefinitely, accumulating in cold conditions and working their way up the food chain. Elevated levels have already been found in Arctic marine life and in the native populations who eat seal and whale meat. And then there was the radioactive waste. The 47,000 gallons of contaminated cooling water from the PM2A reactor poured into a sump in the ice and left to freeze. The exact level of radioactivity is uncertain. Some scientists believe the contamination was relatively low level, primarily tritium and activation products, from circulating through the reactor core. Others are less sanguine. The waste has never been tested because it is buried beneath tens of meters of ice and currently unreachable. Colgan's climate simulations delivered the critical finding. Using regional climate models forced by business-as-usual greenhouse gas emission scenarios, his team determined that as early as 2090, the Camp Century site could transition from net snowfall to net melt. Instead of being buried deeper every year, the waste would begin to be uncovered. Once that transition occurred, it would be irreversible. Meltwater would percolate down through the upper layers of snow and ice, reaching the waste long before the surface melted away entirely. And that meltwater would carry pollutants downhill toward the coast and into the ocean. The study raised uncomfortable political questions. Camp Sentry was an American base, but it sat on Danish soil, which is now the self-governing territory of Greenland. Who was responsible for cleaning up the waste? The United States, which created it? Denmark, which authorized the base but was kept in the dark about its true purpose? Greenland, which had no say in any of it? International law was clear about preventing future hazardous waste, but ambiguous about who was liable for waste that had already been discarded decades earlier in a different political context. And the practical challenges were staggering. The waste was buried under roughly 35 meters of ice. Reaching it would require drilling or excavating in one of the most remote and inhospitable locations on Earth. The cost would be enormous, the technical difficulties immense, and there was the question of what you would do with 47,000 gallons of radioactive water, even if you could reach it. Colgan put it simply, it really becomes a situation of waiting until the ice sheet has melted down to almost expose the wastes that anyone should advocate for site remediation. In other words, there was nothing practical to be done right now. The waste would sit, the ice would melt, and at some point in the future, a problem that was created in 1967 would become someone else's emergency. James White, a climate scientist at the University of Colorado who was not involved in the study, offered a blunt assessment. The assumption that any waste could be buried forever under ice is unrealistic. The question is whether it is going to come out in hundreds of years, in thousands of years, or in tens of thousands of years. The Camp Sentry waste is a time bomb with a slowly ticking clock, and every year as the Arctic warms faster than any other region on Earth, that clock ticks a little faster. But the story of Greenland's ice is not just about what lies buried beneath it. It is also about what happens when the ice itself gives way. And in September of 2023, the world got a terrifying preview. On the morning of September 16th, 2023, a seismologist named Stephen Hicks sat down at his desk in a windowless office at University College London. Dr. Hicks's job was to listen to the planet. His monitors displayed live data streams from seismometers around the world, sensitive instruments buried in the ground that detect vibrations. Normally he was looking for earthquakes. He knew exactly what an earthquake looked like on a screen. A sudden violent spike, a burst of chaotic energy, and then a messy squiggle that faded over minutes or sometimes hours. Earthquakes are loud. They are disorderly. They arrive, announce themselves, and decay. This morning, Dr. Hicks looked at his monitor and saw something entirely different. There was a signal, but it was not a spike. It was a wave. A smooth, rhythmic, repeating wave. Up, down, up, down. With the mechanical precision of a metronome, the vibration was pulsing at a single frequency, once every 92 seconds, not fast enough to feel, not powerful enough to knock anything over, but clearly there, as legible as a heartbeat on a hospital monitor. Hicks sat back and rubbed his eyes. His first instinct was that the sensor was malfunctioning, or perhaps a construction crew was working near the station, some heavy machinery pounding away at regular intervals, or a truck driving past every 90 seconds, something local and mundane. He opened the data from a sensor in a different country to rule out a local glitch. He pulled up a station in Kenya. The same signal was there, same rhythm, same frequency, same clean repeating wave. He pulled up a station in Antarctica. There it was again. North America, Asia, Europe. Every sensor he could find showed the same thing. The entire planet was vibrating. From the North Pole to the South Pole, the Earth was humming at a single note, once every 92 seconds. Hicks posted a screenshot of the signal to social media and asked his colleagues around the world if anyone else was seeing it. Replies flooded in from seismologists on every continent. Everyone was seeing it. Nobody knew what it was. According to the logs from that day, the scientists began calling it a USO, an unidentified seismic object. The name was half serious and half joke, a riff on the UFO terminology. But the signal was no joke. Theories flew. Some assumed it was a secret military test, perhaps a submarine weapon firing low-frequency pulses. Others thought it might be a volcanic eruption, some deep subterranean event creating a resonance in the Earth's crust. But the signal was too clean for a volcano. Volcanoes are messy. They produce broadband noise, a whole spectrum of frequencies jumbled together. This was monochromatic, a single pure tone, like a tuning fork the size of a planet. And it was not stopping. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 12, then 24. The signal continued, unchanged, unwavering. Whatever was producing it showed no sign of decay. Earthquakes last minutes, volcanic tremors last hours, maybe days. This had been going for more than a day and showed no signs of fading. The signal persisted for 9 days, 9 full days of continuous vibration, pulsing through the crust of the Earth at a frequency of 10.88 MHz, once every 92 seconds. When it finally faded, the global seismology community was left staring at their screens in bewilderment. They had witnessed something unprecedented, something that had no explanation in any textbook or any previous observation. But while Dr. Hicks and his colleagues were puzzling over their monitors in London, a very different drama had been playing out in a remote corner of the Arctic, and it had started 5 days before the signal. On September 11th, 2023, a luxury cruise ship called the MV Ocean Explorer was sailing through Alper Fjord in northeast Greenland. The fjord lies within the Northeast Greenland National Park, the most northerly national park in the world, an area nearly the size of France and Spain combined, approximately 80% covered by ice sheet. It is one of the most remote places on Earth. The nearest settlement, a tiny village called Ittoqqortoormiit, was 240 kilometers away. Ittoqqortoormiit itself was nearly 1,400 kilometers from Greenland's capital, Nuuk. In terms of isolation, this was about as far from civilization as you could get on a passenger ship. The Ocean Explorer was a modern expedition vessel, 104 meters long, carrying 206 people. Passengers and crew. The passengers came from Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and the United States. They had paid significant money for the privilege of seeing the untouched wilderness of the high Arctic. Glaciers carving into turquoise water, polar bears on distant shores, the silence of a landscape that has looked the same for 10,000 years. On that Monday, something went wrong. The ship ran aground. Its hull settled into mud and silt at the bottom of the fjord. The captain tried to free it. He reversed the engines. He tried to rock the vessel. He waited for high tide, hoping the rising water would lift the hull clear. It did not work. Tuesday came, another attempt at high tide, another failure. The ship was stuck fast. For 3 days, 206 people were stranded in one of the most isolated places on Earth. The nearest other ship was days away. A fisheries research vessel called the Tarajok was dispatched to assist, but the distances in northeast Greenland are vast and the waters treacherous. While they waited, 3 passengers tested positive for COVID and were placed in isolation. Tensions rose. Food was adequate, but spirits were strained. Members of the Sirius Dog Sled Patrol, a Danish naval unit that enforces sovereignty in the Arctic wilderness, visited the ship by boat to confirm everyone was safe. On Thursday, September 14th, the Tarajok arrived. A heavy line was attached to the Ocean Explorer. At high tide, with the research vessel pulling at full power, the cruise ship finally broke free of the mud. The passengers cheered. The crew was relieved. The ship sailed south out of the fjord system, heading for Iceland and the nearest port where its damaged hull could be inspected. Everyone on board thought they had just survived a scare, an inconvenience, a story to tell at dinner parties. They had no idea how close they had come to something much worse. Because the fjord system where they had been stuck, the network of narrow waterways threading through northeast Greenland, was connected to another fjord less than 100 kilometers away. A fjord called Dixon, and 48 hours after the Ocean Explorer sailed to safety, a mountain fell into Dixon Fjord. At 12:35 UTC on September 16th, 2023, a section of a mountain peak at a place called Hvidstofhorn, roughly 1,200 meters above the water, broke free. The failure block was massive. 150 meters thick, 480 meters wide, and 600 meters long. 25 million cubic meters of rock and ice, roughly the volume of 10,000 Olympic swimming pools or the equivalent of nearly 10 Great Pyramids of Giza. The cause was decades in the making. A glacier at the base of the mountain had been thinning for years as temperatures rose. The ice had acted as a buttress, holding the rock face in place the way a retaining wall holds back a hillside. As the glacier melted and shrank, the support disappeared. The permafrost that bonded the rock together weakened, fractures propagated, and on that September morning, the mountain simply gave up. The rock and ice avalanche plunged down a steep glacial gully, gathering speed as it fell. It reached velocities estimated at 42 meters per second, roughly 94 miles per hour. When it hit the water of Dixon Fjord, the impact was cataclysmic. The initial backsplash created a wave with a run-up height of 200 meters, 650 feet, taller than the Washington Monument, taller than a 50-story building. A wall of water erupting upward from the narrow fjord with a force that scoured rock faces clean and stripped vegetation from the cliffs. But this was not an ordinary tsunami. In the open ocean, a tsunami wave spreads outward and dissipates over hundreds of miles. Dixon Fjord is not the open ocean. It is a narrow channel, roughly 2.7 kilometers wide, with walls rising more than 1,800 meters, 6,000 feet, on either side. The fjord is about 540 meters deep, and crucially, it has a sharp 90-degree bend where it connects to the outer fjord system. The mega tsunami barreled down the channel. When it hit the far wall, it could not escape. The bend trapped it. The wave bounced back. It crossed the fjord in the other direction and hit the opposite wall. Then it bounced again. Back and forth, wall to wall, like water sloshing in a bathtub. Computer simulations run after the event showed that the time it took for the water to travel from one wall to the other and back was exactly 92 seconds. 92 seconds. The precise frequency of the seismic signal that had baffled scientists around the world. Each time the water slammed into a wall, the energy transferred into the bedrock. The impact rang through the crust of the earth like a hammer striking a bell, and because the fjord was so deep and the walls so steep and the geometry so perfectly confining, the water barely lost energy. It just kept sloshing, back and forth, wall to wall, 10,000 times over 9 days. The signal that Dr. Hicks had seen on his monitor in London, the clean rhythmic wave that had appeared on every seismometer on Earth, was not a military weapon. It was not a volcanic eruption. It was not an earthquake. It was a fjord in Greenland, ringing like a giant musical instrument, played by a mountain that had fallen into the sea because the ice that held it up had melted away. 72 kilometers from the impact site, on a small island called Ella, the wave reached the Nanook research station. The station was unoccupied, closed for the winter. When the Danish patrol vessel Knud Rasmussen finally reached the site to inspect the damage, the soldiers on board found the station destroyed. Wooden cabins had been smashed to kindling. Equipment worth $200,000 had been washed away. The ground had been scoured clean, and on the cliffs surrounding the fjord there was a visible line where vegetation had been stripped away by the water. The soldiers measured the height of that line. It was 200 meters above the normal water level. Scientists later confirmed what the timing suggested. If the MV Ocean Explorer had still been stuck in the fjord system when the mountain fell, the ship and everyone on it would have been inside a washing machine. The wave would have reached the stranded vessel within hours, travelling through the connected waterway system. The ship would have been thrown against canyon walls every 90 seconds. For 9 days, no one would have survived, and because of the extreme remoteness of the location, it might have been weeks before anyone knew what had happened. The passengers of the Ocean Explorer escaped by 48 hours. 48 hours between an inconvenient grounding and annihilation. The signal faded on September 25th, 2023, 9 days after it began. The seismometers around the world returned to their normal patterns. The jagged squiggles of ordinary tectonic activity, distant rumbles, microseisms from ocean waves, the constant low hum of a planet that is never truly still. But the mystery remained. Something had shaken the Earth for more than a week, and nobody could explain it. Stephen Hicks knew he could not solve this alone. The signal had been detected globally, which meant the answer would require global collaboration. Within days of the event, he began reaching out to colleagues across disciplines and across borders: seismologists, geophysicists, oceanographers, glaciologists, landslide experts, tsunami modelers, satellite analysts. The problem was too large and too strange for any single field to crack. It demanded the kind of investigation that resembled less a research project and more an air crash inquiry. Dozens of specialists examining different pieces of wreckage and trying to reconstruct what happened. The team that assembled was extraordinary. 68 scientists from 41 institutions across 15 countries. They came from Denmark, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Norway, and beyond. Each brought a different instrument, a different data set, a different way of seeing the problem, and collectively they set about dismantling the mystery piece by piece. The first task was locating the source. Seismic waves travel at known speeds through rock. By comparing the arrival times of the signal at different stations around the world, the team could triangulate its origin. The calculations pointed to eastern Greenland. A broad area, but a start. They needed to narrow it down. They contacted the Danish Joint Arctic Command, the military authority responsible for Greenland's waters. The Arctic Command had received reports of unusual activity in the fjord system of northeast Greenland around the time the signal began. Specifically, the Nanook research station on Ella Island had been damaged. The patrol vessel Knud Rasmussen had been dispatched to investigate and had documented the destruction. Smashed buildings, scoured ground. That telltale line of stripped vegetation high on the cliff faces. The scientist overlaid the location of the damage with the calculated origin point of the seismic signal. The match was precise. Whatever had caused the signal had also caused the destruction at Ella Island, and the most likely vector was water. A tsunami. But a tsunami by itself could not explain a 9-day signal. Tsunamis are violent but brief. A wave hits a coast, surges, inland retreats, and the seismic signature fades within hours at most. Something else had to be sustaining the vibration. Something that kept the energy cycling instead of dissipating. The next clue came from satellite imagery. Christian Svenevig, a geologist at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, began comparing before and after photographs of the Dixon Fjord area. The before images, taken in the weeks prior to September 16th, showed a mountain peak rising above the fjord, its base flanked by a glacier tongue that descended to the waterline. The after images showed something startling. A massive section of the mountain was gone. Where solid rock had stood, there was now a raw scar, a fresh wound in the mountainside exposing pale stone beneath. Svenevig measured the missing section. The failure block had been roughly 150 meters thick, 480 meters wide, and 600 meters long. 25 million cubic meters of material had detached from the peak and fallen into the fjord below. The evidence was consistent with a catastrophic rock avalanche, one of the largest ever documented in Greenland. But the team still needed to connect the rock slide to the seismic signal. A rock slide generates its own seismic waves, a brief chaotic burst lasting seconds to minutes. The 9-day signal was something fundamentally different. Monochromatic, meaning it contained only a single frequency. Sustained, meaning it continued long after any impact event should have ended. And global, meaning it was powerful enough to register on instruments thousands of kilometers away. The key was the fjord itself. Dixon Fjord is not like most bodies of water. It is a narrow slot cut deep into the bedrock of Greenland, 540 meters deep and only 2.7 kilometers wide. The walls rise more than 1,800 meters above the water on both sides, and at its western end the fjord makes a sharp bend, almost 90 degrees, before connecting to the broader fjord system that eventually reaches the sea. This geometry is critical. In an open body of water, a tsunami wave radiates outward in all directions, spreading its energy over an ever larger area until it diminishes to nothing. But in Dixon Fjord, the wave had nowhere to go. It was trapped. The team ran computer simulations using supercomputers to model what happened when 25 million cubic meters of rock and ice struck the surface of this confined body of water at nearly 100 miles per hour. The simulations showed the initial wave erupting to a height of more than 200 meters at the impact site. This wall of water then raced down the length of the fjord. When it reached the sharp bend at the western end, most of the wave's energy was reflected back. The wave returned the way it had come, crossing the fjord and striking the eastern wall. There, it reflected again, and again, and again. The technical term for this phenomenon is a seiche. A seiche is a standing wave in an enclosed or semi-enclosed body of water, caused by an external force that displaces the water from its equilibrium. You can create a seiche in a bathtub by pushing the water to one end and letting it slosh back and forth. The physics are the same at any scale. What differs is the energy involved. The simulations showed that the period of the seiche in Dixon Fjord, the time it took for the water to travel from one wall to the other and back, was approximately 92 seconds. This matched the seismic signal exactly. Each time the water mass slammed into a wall, the kinetic energy of millions of tons of moving water transferred into the bedrock. The bedrock vibrated, and that vibration propagated through the Earth's crust as a seismic wave, travelling outward at the speed of sound in rock, reaching instruments on every continent within an hour. The reason the signal lasted 9 days was that the fjord acted as an almost perfect resonator. The deep water, the steep vertical walls, and the narrow geometry minimized energy loss. With each oscillation, the wave lost only a tiny fraction of its energy to friction, turbulence, and the slight leakage of water around the bend into the outer fjord. The initial displacement was so enormous, and the energy retention so efficient that the seiche continued for more than 10,000 oscillations before it finally decayed below the detection threshold of the seismometers. Lead author Christian Svenevig said that when they set out on the investigation, everybody was puzzled, and no one had the faintest idea what caused the signal. All they knew was that it was somehow associated with a landslide. They only managed to solve the mystery through a huge interdisciplinary and international effort. Stephen Hicks described the event in vivid terms. The fjord was behaving like a big musical instrument, a tuning fork carved out of rock and ice and water, struck by a mountain falling from the sky, ringing at a single note that the entire planet could hear. The research was published in September of 2024 in the journal Science, 1 year after the event. The paper documented not only the mechanics of the landslide and the tsunami in the seiche, but also the underlying cause. The glacier at the base of the mountain had been thinning for decades. Climate change had warmed the Arctic. The glacier retreated. The permafrost that bonded the mountain rock weakened and failed. Without the buttressing support of the ice, the mountainside became unstable, and on September 16th, it collapsed. This was not the first landslide tsunami in Greenland. In 2017, an avalanche in Karat Fjord in western Greenland triggered a tsunami that destroyed 11 houses in the village of Nuugaatsiaq and killed 4 people. Landslide tsunamis have been documented elsewhere in the Arctic, in Alaska, in Norway and Iceland, but the Dixon Fjord event was unprecedented in its scale and in its consequences. No previous landslide had generated a seismic signal detectable worldwide for 9 days. No previous event had demonstrated so clearly how climate change could trigger a cascade of geological effects with planetary reach. The team also confirmed what the timeline had implied. The MV Ocean Explorer, the cruise ship that ran aground in nearby Alper Fjord, had been freed just 48 hours before the landslide. If the ship had remained stuck, the tsunami would have propagated through the connected fjord system and reached the vessel within hours. The water level fluctuations, even at 72 kilometers from the impact site, were enough to destroy a research station. At closer range, the effects would have been catastrophic for any ship in the water. Even after the initial mega tsunami subsided to a seiche with surface fluctuations of perhaps 10 meters or less, the continuous sloshing for 9 days would have made the fjord system impassable. No rescue vessel could have reached the cruise ship. Communications in that part of Greenland are limited. Satellite phones might have worked, but there would have been little anyone could do. The ship and its 206 passengers and crew would have been at the mercy of a fjord that was ringing like a bell. The near miss was a matter of luck, 48 hours of luck, and luck is not a strategy for managing risk in a rapidly warming Arctic. Almost exactly 1 month later, on October 11th, 2023, the seismometers picked up the signal again. Same frequency, same location, but quieter this time. Another piece of the mountain had broken away and fallen into the fjord. A smaller event, but proof that the mountain was still unstable. The process that had caused the first collapse was ongoing. The glacier was still thinning, the permafrost was still degrading, more rock was waiting to fall. The question was no longer whether this would happen again. The question was when, and where, and whether anyone would be in the path next time. To understand why a mountain fell into a fjord in Greenland, you have to understand what is happening to the Arctic, and what is happening to the Arctic is unlike anything that has occurred in recorded human history. The Arctic is warming roughly 2 to 4 times faster than the global average. This phenomenon, known as Arctic amplification, is driven by a feedback loop that accelerates as it runs. Ice and snow are white. They reflect sunlight back into space. When temperatures rise and ice melts, it exposes darker surfaces, ocean water, and bare rock that absorb more heat. The absorbed heat melts more ice. The cycle reinforces itself. Every degree of warming produces disproportionate effects in the polar regions. The Greenland ice sheet is the second largest body of ice on Earth, smaller only than Antarctica. It covers roughly 1.7 million square kilometers and contains enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by approximately 7.5 meters if it all melted. That is 24 feet, enough to redraw the maps of every coastal nation, enough to displace hundreds of millions of people. The ice sheet is not melting all at once. It is melting from the edges inward and from the surface down. Every summer, the surface of the ice sheet experiences melt. Pools of blue water form on the white surface, absorbing more heat and accelerating the process. Meltwater flows downward through cracks and crevasses, reaching the bedrock beneath the ice and lubricating the base, causing glaciers to slide faster toward the sea. At the coast, outlet glaciers carve enormous icebergs into the ocean, carrying frozen mass away from the ice sheet at rates that have been increasing for decades. Since 1996, the Greenland ice sheet has been losing more ice through melting and carving than it gains through snowfall. The balance has tipped. The deficit is growing. Between 2002 and 2020, Greenland lost an average of roughly 270 billion tons of ice per year. That is not a typo. 270 billion tons. Every single year. This meltwater flows into the ocean, contributing to global sea level rise. Greenland alone has added approximately 1.4 centimeters to global sea levels since 1972. That number sounds small until you consider that it is accelerating, and that it combines with contributions from Antarctic ice loss, mountain glacier retreat, and the thermal expansion of warming ocean water. The total sea level rise from all sources between 1901 and 2018 was between 15 and 25 centimeters. But the effects of ice loss extend far beyond sea level. The Greenland ice sheet is so massive that its melting affects ocean circulation. The cold, fresh water pouring off the ice sheet into the North Atlantic is altering the salinity and temperature of the ocean surface. This disruption is connected to the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, AMOC, the vast conveyor belt of ocean currents that carries warm water northward from the tropics and cold water southward along the deep ocean floor. The AMOC drives weather patterns across the Northern Hemisphere. It moderates the climate of Western Europe. Its weakening or collapse, which some models project could occur within this century, would have consequences that are difficult to fully predict but almost certainly severe. All of this is context for what happened at Dixon Fjord. The mountain did not fall because of bad luck. It fell because the systems that held it in place were failing. Glaciers act as buttresses. A glacier filling a valley or pressed against a mountainside provides lateral support, pushing back against the rock and holding it in place. When the glacier thins or retreats, that support disappears. The rock face is left exposed and unsupported. If the rock is fractured, if it is weakened by freeze-thaw cycles, if the permafrost that cements it together has degraded, then the mountainside becomes a loaded spring waiting for a trigger. Permafrost is frozen ground. In the Arctic and in high mountains around the world, the soil and rock below a certain depth remain frozen year-round. This frozen layer acts as glue, binding loose material together and preventing it from moving. As temperatures rise, the active layer, the surface zone that thaws each summer, deepens. Permafrost that has been frozen for thousands of years begins to warm and soften. The glue dissolves. Rock that was stable becomes unstable. At Dixon Fjord, both processes were at work. The The glacier at the base of the mountain had been thinning for decades, losing its buttressing capacity. The permafrost in the mountain above had been warming, weakening the bonds between rock layers. The two processes converged. The glacier could no longer hold the mountain. The permafrost could no longer hold itself together. On September 16th, 2023, the mountain let go. This was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern that scientists have been tracking with increasing alarm across the Arctic and in high mountain regions around the world. In 2017, a landslide in Karat Fjord in western Greenland triggered a tsunami that reached the village of Nuugaatsiaq. The wave destroyed 11 houses and killed 4 people. The village was permanently abandoned. The cause was the same, a destabilized slope giving way as ice retreated and permafrost thawed. In 2015, a massive landslide in Fjord in Alaska sent nearly 200 million tons of rock into the water, generating a tsunami that reached 193 meters in height. The area was uninhabited, but the event demonstrated the scale of what glacial retreat could unleash. In 1958, the largest known tsunami in recorded history occurred at Lituya Bay in Alaska, when an earthquake triggered a rock slide that generated a wave 524 meters tall, over 1,700 feet, taller than the Empire State Building. The bay's narrow geometry, similar to a fjord, concentrated the wave energy. Only 2 people died, because Lituya Bay was nearly uninhabited. But the event showed what happens when enormous volumes of material enter confined bodies of water. Scientists have now identified unstable slopes across the Arctic that could produce similar events. In Alaska, the slopes around Barry Arm Fjord have been moving slowly for years. Researchers fear that a sudden collapse could send millions of cubic meters of rock into the fjord, generating a tsunami that would reach the town of Whittier, 48 kilometers away, within minutes. Whittier has a population of roughly 200 people. It is accessible by a single road through a tunnel. Evacuation options are limited. In Norway, the Akneset rock slide has been monitored for decades. A massive block of mountain is creeping slowly towards Sunilvsfjorden. When it eventually falls, it will generate a tsunami that could devastate the communities along the fjord. Norway has invested heavily in monitoring and early warning systems for this specific threat. In Greenland, the problem is particularly acute because the coastline is deeply incised with fjords, many of them steep-walled and narrow, exactly the geometry that concentrates tsunami energy and creates the conditions for seiches. As glaciers retreat and permafrost thaws, the number of unstable slopes is increasing, and Greenland is becoming more accessible. Cruise tourism in Greenland has been growing rapidly. Danish broadcasters reported 400 cruises in 2022 and 600 in 2023. More ships in more fjords means more people exposed to risks that are growing as the climate warms. The Dixon Fjord event was a warning shot. It demonstrated that climate change is not just about slowly rising seas and gradually shifting weather patterns. It can produce sudden, violent, and completely unexpected geological events. A mountain that stood for millennia can fall in seconds. A fjord can become a weapon. A planet can ring like a bell for 9 days. And the connection between Camp Century and Dixon Fjord is not merely geographic. Both stories are about the same thing. The ice of Greenland, which we once treated as permanent and indestructible, is changing. The ice that was supposed to entomb Cold War waste forever is melting. The ice that was supposed to hold mountains in place is retreating. The ice that was supposed to be eternal is not eternal at all. We built a city under the ice and assumed the ice would protect our secrets. We carved tunnels and installed a nuclear reactor and poured radioactive waste into a hole and walked away, confident that the cold would keep everything safe. We were wrong. We looked at mountains that had stood since the last ice age and assumed they would stand forever. We sailed cruise ships through their shadows and marveled at their beauty. We were wrong about that too. The ice is talking to us. It has been talking for decades. The question is whether we are listening, and the question after that is whether listening will be enough. Greenland has always been caught between powers larger than itself. For centuries, it was a Danish colony, governed from Copenhagen by officials who had never set foot on the ice. Its indigenous Inuit population, the Kalalit, had lived on the coasts for thousands of years, hunting seals and whales and adapting to one of the harshest environments on Earth with extraordinary skill and resilience. Danish colonization brought Christianity, European diseases, and a gradual erosion of traditional culture. It also brought a strategic location into the orbit of European and, eventually, American geopolitics. During the Second World War, when Germany occupied Denmark, the United States moved to secure Greenland, recognizing its strategic importance for controlling the North Atlantic shipping lanes and as a base for air routes between North America and Europe. The 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement formalized the American military presence, and Thule Air Base became a cornerstone of Cold War Arctic strategy. Camp Century followed. Project Iceworm followed that. At no point were the people of Greenland meaningfully consulted about any of it. The discovery of Project Iceworm in 1997 brought this history into sharp and painful focus. The Americans had planned to turn Greenland into a nuclear weapons platform without telling the Danes, and the Danes had authorized a military presence without telling the Greenlanders. The betrayal ran in layers. Each layer was built on assumptions about who had the right to make decisions about Greenland's land, Greenland's ice, and Greenland's future. Greenland achieved home rule in 1979 and further self-government in 2009. Today, it manages most of its own affairs, with Denmark retaining control of foreign policy and defence. The relationship is evolving, and independence is a frequent topic of political discussion. Greenland has its own parliament, its own flag, and a growing sense of national identity. But it remains economically dependent on a substantial annual subsidy from Denmark, and its population of roughly 56,000 people faces the challenges of a vast, sparsely inhabited territory with limited infrastructure. The waste at Camp Century sits at the intersection of all these tensions. Who is responsible for cleaning it up? The United States created the waste. It operated the base. It poured the radioactive water into the ice and walked away. Under most interpretations of international law, the polluter bears responsibility, but the United States did not act unilaterally. Denmark authorized Camp Century. Danish officials, if not the Danish public, were aware that a nuclear reactor was operating on their territory. Denmark's ambiguous handling of the Iceworm question, that carefully worded non-answer from Prime Minister Hansen, enabled the entire enterprise. And then there is Greenland itself. The waste is on Greenlandic soil. When and if it surfaces, it will contaminate Greenlandic waters and potentially affect Greenlandic ecosystems and communities. Greenland's government argues, with considerable justification, that it bears no responsibility for decisions made by the United States and Denmark decades before Greenland achieved self-governance. The waste was created without Greenlandic consent. The risks were imposed without Greenlandic knowledge. The cleanup, whenever it comes, should not be Greenland's burden. International law is ill-equipped to handle this kind of problem. Existing frameworks are designed to prevent future pollution and to assign liability for ongoing contamination. They struggle with waste that was legally discarded under the assumptions of a different era and is now being remobilized by climate change, a phenomenon that the original polluters did not anticipate and may not have caused in any direct sense. The Camp Century waste was legal when it was left behind. Nobody broke any laws. The ice was supposed to take care of it. William Colgan, the glaciologist who first quantified the threat, described it as a new breed of political challenge. 2 generations ago, people were interring waste in different areas of the world, and now climate change is modifying those sites. The legal and diplomatic frameworks have not caught up, and Camp Century is not the only example. Across the Arctic there are abandoned military installations, industrial sites, and waste dumps that were built on the assumption of permanent cold. As the Arctic warms, these sites are beginning to thaw, releasing contaminants that were supposed to stay frozen forever. The geopolitical significance of Greenland has only grown in recent years. The island sits atop substantial mineral resources, including rare earth elements critical to modern technology. Its waters may hold significant oil and gas reserves. Its strategic position, astride the shortest routes between North America, Europe, and Russia, makes it a prize for major powers. China has expressed interest in Greenland's mineral wealth and has made overtures about investment and infrastructure development. Russia, with its own extensive Arctic coastline, views any expansion of Western military presence in the Arctic with suspicion. The United States has reaffirmed its strategic interest in Greenland repeatedly. In recent years, American political leaders have discussed the possibility of acquiring Greenland outright, a proposal that was dismissed by Danish and Greenlandic officials but that reflected a genuine reassessment of Greenland's strategic value. The Arctic is opening. As sea ice retreats, shipping routes that were once impassable are becoming navigable for longer seasons. The northern sea route along Russia's coast and the northwest passage through the Canadian Arctic are being used by commercial vessels. Greenland sits at the crossroads of these emerging maritime corridors. For Greenland's own people, the changes are deeply personal. Warming temperatures are altering the ecosystems on which traditional livelihoods depend. Sea ice that hunters once travelled across is forming later, breaking up earlier, and becoming unpredictable. Animal migration patterns are shifting. New species are appearing while familiar ones decline. The cultural practices that have sustained Greenlandic communities for generations are being disrupted by changes that Greenlanders did not cause and cannot control. The irony is bitter. Greenland contributes virtually nothing to global greenhouse gas emissions. Its 56,000 people live modestly in a land where resources are scarce and life is shaped by the ice. Yet Greenland is bearing some of the most dramatic consequences of a global problem created overwhelmingly by industrialized nations thousands of miles away. The mountains that are falling into fjords are falling because of carbon dioxide emitted by factories and automobiles and power plants in countries that most Greenlanders will never visit. And now those same Greenlanders may have to deal with radioactive waste left behind by the military of a foreign nation. Waste that is surfacing because the ice that was supposed to contain it is melting, due to a climate crisis they did not create. Camp Century is a parable. It is a story about assumptions, about the belief that the natural world is permanent and controllable, that you can bury your waste and it will stay buried, that you can build inside a glacier and the glacier will hold still, that you can warm the atmosphere and the consequences will remain abstract and distant. Every one of those assumptions has proven wrong, and the people paying the price are rarely the people who made the decisions. The waste at Camp Century will surface eventually. The current best estimate is sometime around 2090, give or take a few decades depending on emission trajectories. When it does, someone will have to deal with it. 200,000 litres of diesel fuel, 240,000 litres of sewage, toxic PCBs that never degrade, 47,000 gallons of radioactive cooling water, 9,000 tons of crushed infrastructure, all of it slowly emerging from the ice like a fossil from an ancient seabed, a relic of a war that was never fought, preserved in the medium that was supposed to hide it forever. The diplomatic negotiations over who pays for the cleanup have not begun in earnest. All parties understand the problem is coming. None are eager to claim responsibility. The amounts of money involved will be substantial, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars for a full remediation in one of the most remote and logistically challenging locations on Earth. And there is no guarantee that the technology needed to safely remove and contain the waste at Camp Century even exists yet. For now, the waste sits in the dark, 35 meters below the surface of the ice sheet, sinking a little less each year as the melt begins to overtake the snowfall. The clock is ticking, and the ice, which has been the silent custodian of this mess for nearly 60 years, is slowly releasing its grip. The world left its garbage in Greenland's freezer. Greenland's freezer is warming up, and nobody has made a plan for what happens when the door opens. Dixon Fjord was a warning, but it was not the only warning. Across the Arctic and in high mountain regions around the world, the same forces that brought down a mountain in Greenland are at work on thousands of other slopes. The ice is retreating, the permafrost is thawing, and the ground that we have always assumed was solid is beginning to move. In Alaska, the slopes surrounding Barry Arm Fjord have been the subject of growing concern among geologists. Satellite imagery shows that a massive block of rock on the mountainside above the fjord has been creeping slowly downhill for years. The movement is measured in centimeters per year, barely perceptible, but relentless. The glacier that once supported the base of the slope has thinned and retreated, removing the buttress that held the rock in place. Scientists estimate that if the slope fails catastrophically, between 500 million and 1 billion cubic meters of material could crash into the fjord. That is roughly 20 to 40 times the volume of the Dixon Fjord landslide. The resulting tsunami could reach the town of Whittier, Alaska, 48 kilometers away within minutes. Whittier has a population of about 200 people. It is connected to the outside world by a single road that passes through a 2.5-mile long tunnel. If the tunnel is blocked or damaged, there is no way out by land. Evacuation by sea would be the only option, but a tsunami wave arriving in the harbour would make that impossible precisely when it was most needed. The United States Geological Survey has been monitoring Barry Arm since the threat was identified. Seismometers have been installed, satellite monitoring is ongoing, but monitoring is not the same as prevention. There is no practical way to stabilise a mountainside that is hundreds of metres tall and millions of tons in mass. You cannot bolt a mountain to the ground. You can only watch it and hope to give people enough warning to get out of the way. In Norway, the situation at Akneset has been a national concern for decades. A massive section of mountain overlooking Sunilfsfjorden and the Geirangerfjord, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has been identified as actively unstable. The block is roughly 54 million cubic metres, and it is moving. Instruments embedded in the rock measure the rate of creep. The Norwegian government has invested heavily in monitoring equipment and early warning systems. Sirens are installed in the communities along the fjord. Evacuation routes have been planned and drilled. When the mountain falls, and geologists say it is a matter of when rather than if, a tsunami of 30 to 80 metres could sweep down the fjord. The hope is that the monitoring system will provide enough advance warning, perhaps 30 minutes, to allow people to reach high ground. Norway has the resources and infrastructure to mount this kind of response. Many of the places where similar threats exist do not. In remote parts of Greenland, in the Himalayas, in Patagonia, in the Canadian Arctic, unstable slopes threaten communities and ecosystems that have no monitoring systems, no sirens, no evacuation plans, and no one watching. The problem extends beyond landslides and tsunamis. Permafrost thaw is destabilizing infrastructure across the Arctic. Roads buckle and crack as the ground beneath them softens. Buildings tilt and settle as their foundations shift. Pipelines designed to rest on frozen ground develop leaks as the permafrost beneath them turns to mud. Airports built on permanently frozen runways find that the runways are no longer permanently frozen. In Siberia, permafrost thaw has created vast fields of thermokarst, irregular terrain formed by the collapse of ground above melting ice. Lakes appear and disappear. Sinkholes open without warning. Entire sections of coastline crumble into the sea as the frozen bluffs that held them in place dissolve. Indigenous communities that have lived in the Arctic for millennia are watching their landscapes transform in ways that no living person has seen before. And permafrost holds more than just ice and soil, it holds methane, vast quantities of organic material, the remains of plants and animals that died thousands of years ago, are locked in the frozen ground. As the permafrost thaws, microbes break down this organic material and release methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Methane is a greenhouse gas roughly 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. The release of methane from thawing permafrost could create another feedback loop, warming leading to thawing, leading to methane release, leading to more warming. The Arctic is not a distant abstraction. It is a system connected to the rest of the planet through ocean currents, atmospheric circulation, and the basic physics of heat and ice and water. What happens in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. The meltwater that runs off the ice sheet raises sea levels in Miami and Mumbai and Shanghai. The fresh water that pours into the North Atlantic disrupts currents that regulate the climate of Europe. The methane that escapes from Siberian permafrost enters the same atmosphere that blankets every city on Earth. The events of September 2023 demonstrated this interconnection in a visceral way. A mountain fell in one of the most remote places on Earth, a fjord that most people have never heard of, in a part of Greenland that very few humans have ever visited, and the vibration was felt everywhere, on every continent, at every seismic station. The planet rang like a bell, and every instrument that was listening heard the note. This is what climate change looks like when it stops being gradual and becomes sudden. We tend to think of warming as a slow process, a fraction of a degree per decade, a few millimeters of sea level per year, a slight shift in the timing of seasons, and much of it is slow. But slow processes can reach tipping points where the accumulated pressure triggers rapid, violent change. A glacier thins for decades, and then a mountain falls in seconds. An ice sheet loses mass gradually, and then a coastal community floods in a single storm. Permafrost warms by fractions of a degree each year, and then a sinkhole opens under a building overnight. The Dixon Fjord mega tsunami was not a one-off anomaly, it was a preview. Climate scientists have been warning for years that warming will produce not just gradual shifts, but sudden, catastrophic events. The models predicted this, the physics demanded it, and now the data confirms it. A landslide in Greenland shook the planet for 9 days. A wave 200 meters tall destroyed a research station. A cruise ship carrying 206 people missed catastrophe by 48 hours. And a month later, it happened again. Smaller, quieter, but unmistakable. The mountain was still falling. The process was ongoing, and no one could say when the next collapse would come, or how large it would be, or who would be in its path. Researchers are now combing through seismic archives looking for similar slow pulses that might have been overlooked in the past. If the Dixon Fjord site produced a 9-day signal detectable globally, it is possible that similar events have occurred before and gone unrecognized. Perhaps other mega tsunamis have rung other fjords in other parts of the world, producing signals that were dismissed as noise or instrument error. The scientific tools to detect and interpret these events are relatively new. We may have been living alongside these phenomena for years without knowing it. The Surface Water and Ocean Topography Satellite, known as SWOT, launched in December of 2022 by NASA and the French space agency CNIA, is now providing unprecedented views of ocean and lake surfaces around the world. SWOT maps a 30-mile-wide swath of water with resolution fine enough to detect waves and water level changes that previous instruments missed entirely. In October of 2023, SWOT passed over Dixon Fjord during the second smaller Seiche event and captured direct measurements of the water surface, confirming the sloshing pattern and providing the first satellite observation of a Seiche in progress. This kind of data will be critical for understanding and eventually predicting future events. But understanding is not the same as preventing. We can monitor unstable slopes. We can model wave propagation in fjords. We can install warning systems in vulnerable communities. But we cannot stop the warming that is destabilizing the mountains. We cannot refreeze the permafrost. We cannot put the glacier back. The only way to address the root cause is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving the warming. Everything else is managing symptoms, important symptoms, life-saving symptoms in some cases, but symptoms nonetheless. The disease is the warming itself, and the prognosis, at current emission trajectories, is more of everything we have seen. More melting, more thawing, more landslides, more tsunamis, more waste emerging from the ice, more mountains falling into the sea. Greenland is telling us something. The Camp Century waste and the Dixon Fjord mega tsunami are not separate stories. They are the same story told through different chapters. The story of a planet that is changing faster than the systems we built to manage it. The story of consequences arriving sooner than anyone expected. The story of ice that was supposed to last forever, giving way. If you stand on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet today, at the site where Camp Century once thrived, you see nothing. Flat white snow and blue sky in every direction. No structures, no markers, no hint that 200 men once lived and worked and argued and laughed and shivered beneath your feet. No sign of a nuclear reactor, no trace of a barbershop or a chapel or a bowling alley. The ice has swallowed everything. It looks clean. It looks eternal. It looks like a place where secrets could be kept forever. But 35 meters beneath, your boots, the city is still there. The steel arches are crushed but recognizable. The tunnels have collapsed into rough corridors of compacted debris. The fuel tanks sit in their ice tombs, their contents leaching slowly into the surrounding matrix. The radioactive sump is frozen in place, a pool of contaminated ice that has not moved in nearly 60 years. The PCBs are embedded in the wreckage of buildings that were state-of-the-art in 1960, and are now archaeological artifacts pressed between layers of glacier, and the ice above is getting thinner, not quickly, not dramatically, not in the kind of catastrophic collapse that makes headlines, but steadily, year by year, the balance between snowfall and melt is shifting. The margins of the ice sheet are retreating. The interior is warming. The scientists who visit the Camp Century site now report that the surface ice, which was always classified as dry snow, snow that never melted, has begun to show traces of melt almost. every summer. The assumptions that justified leaving the waste behind are failing in real time. 60 years ago, the United States Army built a city inside a glacier to test whether nuclear missiles could be hidden beneath the ice. The project failed because the ice moved. The glacier would not hold still. It squeezed the tunnels, crushed the buildings, and made the dream of an underground nuclear railroad impossible. The ice won that battle. Now the ice is fighting a different battle. Against the warmth, against the slow accumulation of heat that is softening its surface, thinning its edges, and loosening its grip on everything it holds. The waste at Camp Century, the mountains above its fjords, the permafrost that binds its rocky slopes, all of it is connected, all of it is changing. And the ice, which defeated the US Army in 5 years, may not defeat the climate. The Camp Century ice core, that cylinder of frozen history pulled from a mile beneath the surface, told us something we desperately needed to know. It told us that the ice sheet has melted before. It showed us plant fossils from a time when Greenland was green, when tundra grass and Arctic willow grew where a mile of ice now stands. It proved that the ice sheet is not permanent. It has come and gone with the rhythms of Earth's climate, growing during cold periods and shrinking during warm ones. The warm period we are now entering is not like the natural cycles of the past. It is faster. It is being driven not by orbital variations or volcanic activity, but by the combustion of fossil fuels, a process that is adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at a rate unprecedented in the geological record. The last time carbon dioxide levels were this high, roughly 420 parts per million, was more than 3 million years ago, during the Pliocene epoch, when sea levels were somewhere between 5 and 25 meters higher than today. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica were dramatically smaller, or gone entirely. We are not yet at Pliocene conditions, but we are moving in that direction, and the ice is responding. The question is not whether the Greenland ice sheet will shrink further. It will. The question is how much and how fast. Models suggest that even if we achieve the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, Greenland will still contribute about 6 centimeters to global sea level rise by the end of this century. If emissions continue on their current trajectory, the contribution could be 13 centimeters or more, and in the worst-case scenarios, it could be 33 centimeters, more than a foot, from Greenland alone. These numbers matter because sea level rise is not evenly distributed. Tides, ocean currents, and the gravitational effects of ice sheets themselves mean that some regions will experience much more than the global average. Coastal cities in the tropics and subtropics will be hit hardest. Low-lying island nations face existential threats, and even in wealthy countries with the resources to build sea walls and flood defences, the costs will be staggering. But the story of Greenland is not only about sea level, it is about the unexpected. The Camp Century waste was unexpected. Nobody planned for a Cold War garbage dump to become an environmental crisis. The Dixon Fjord mega tsunami was unexpected. Nobody anticipated that a mountain would fall into a fjord and ring the planet like a bell for 9 days. The frozen plant fossils in the Camp Century subglacial core were unexpected. Nobody imagined that a military drilling project would produce one of the most important pieces of evidence for ice sheet vulnerability in the geological record. Climate change specializes in the unexpected. It takes systems that we thought we understood, ice sheets, ocean currents, permafrost, mountain slopes, and pushes them into states that have no precedent in human experience. We are running an experiment on the only planet we have, and we do not fully understand the experimental apparatus. The results are arriving in real time, and some of them are shocking. The 68 scientists who solved the mystery of the 9-day seismic signal said something important in their conclusions. They said that the Dixon Fjord event highlighted how climate change is driving the emergence of unprecedented extremes, particularly in remote regions where our ability to monitor conditions is limited. The word unprecedented is key. We are entering territory where the past is no longer a reliable guide to the future. The ice cores can tell us what happened during previous warm periods. They cannot tell us exactly what will happen during this one, because this one is different, faster, more extreme, driven by forces that did not exist during previous warming cycles. The people of Greenland are living on the front line of this transformation. Their ice is melting, their mountains are falling, Their traditional ways of life are being disrupted by changes they did not cause, and now they face the prospect of managing toxic waste that a foreign military left behind half a century ago, waste that is surfacing because the same warming that threatens their culture is dissolving the ice that was supposed to contain it. There is a temptation, when confronting stories like this, to feel overwhelmed, to conclude that the problems are too large, too complex, too deeply rooted to address. But the history of Camp Century itself argues against despair. The ice core that was drilled for military purposes became one of the foundations of climate science. The subglacial sediment that was collected almost as an afterthought, and then lost for 50 years, became a critical piece of evidence about ice sheet behaviour. Knowledge emerged from folly. Understanding grew from secrecy. The very project that epitomizes Cold War recklessness also produced tools that help us comprehend the crisis we face today. That is not irony. That is the messy, contradictory way that human progress actually works. We stumble into knowledge, we make terrible decisions and then learn from them. We bury our mistakes in the ice and then, decades later, the ice teaches us why those mistakes mattered. The question is whether we learn fast enough. Camp Century is still down there. The waste is still there. The ice is still melting. The mountains of East Greenland are still unstable. The Arctic is still warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. The clock is still ticking. And somewhere beneath the surface of the ice sheet, in a frozen sump that has not seen light since 1967, 47,000 gallons of radioactive water are waiting for the warmth to reach them, waiting for the meltwater to carry them downhill, waiting for the ocean. The ice has held its secrets for 60 years. It will not hold them forever. What happens next is up to us. If you enjoy deep investigations into hidden history and the science behind our changing planet, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Tell me in the comments, what shocked you most? The secret nuclear base buried under the ice, the mega tsunami that shook the Earth for 9 days, or the fact that a cruise ship full of passengers missed catastrophe by just 48 hours? And what should we investigate next? There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Places where history and science and human ambition collide in ways that are extraordinary and unsettling. Every frozen landscape has its secrets. Every melting glacier has its warnings. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next investigation.